All right, hello everybody. How are we all doing today? Good. Well, welcome to the Journey Museum and Learning Center. My name is Megan, and I'm the archivist curator here. I do have to admit I'm not feeling the greatest today. I'm normally a wanderer for a speaker, but I'm going to be sitting down today. So just wanted to warn y'all about that. This program is called the Western Skies and Lakota Star Knowledge, and this is going through each one of our seasons. And so we did a winter version of this program back in January, and then there will be programs coming up in the next few seasons as well. And in July, we will actually be presenting this program at the Badlands Astronomy Festival on July 30th. So that's a pretty fun festival if any of y'all are interested in going out to the Badlands and seeing telescopes and hearing about the summer skies. And so today we will be looking at what the spring skies look like here in Rapid City. And to start with, I want to get into how we got constellations. And so constellations and actually all of space was first studied from the standpoint of a geocentric standpoint, meaning that we all thought the Earth was the center of our whole universe and everything else went around us. And so, as we know now, that is not true. But back in the day when that was the idea, you can definitely imagine why people thought that, right? The sun is rising and setting every single day. The moon is rising and setting. The stars kind of seem like they're going in a circle. And so that was just the best that they could come up with. And they came up with constellations as a way to put order to the chaos. If you think about, if you were telling someone from a different continent where you lived, you wouldn't just say, oh, I live in North America. You'd be like, no, I live in South Dakota, because that's narrowing down that scope of our continent for them. It's the same thing with constellations. We're not just telling them, oh, I live in the northern hemisphere. Oh, no, I'm close to this constellation. Or, oh, this planet is in Virgo. And astronomers generally know exactly what that means. And so that's why we started coming up with constellations. And so here in this little video, it's showing you all of the zodiac constellations, which were actually some of the first ones that were named as constellations, and that's because these are ones that are in their own ecliptic, which means that they're traveling together and in line. And so we see the sun pass through all of these constellations. And so that's how we ended up with some of those constellations. But now we know that we are not at the center of the whole universe. We are just one small piece of that. And one evidence of that are these star trails. And so at that one point there in the corner, you can see that there's not really that circle. And that's where Polaris would be, or the North Pole. And so that's where we are rotating. And then you can see all of the other stars rotating, or us rotating, all of the other stars appearing to move through the night sky. And what? I just lost my train of thought on that. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'll just move to the next one. And so the other thing that we know, so that was talking about rotation of the Earth. And the other thing we know about the Earth is that we are orbiting. And so we are on a separate plane from all the constellations called the orbital plane. And that's what all of our planets are on around our sun. And so what I always like to describe that as is if I were to draw all of my planets on this piece of paper and I just move this piece of paper around, they'd all move together, right? It's the exact same thing. That's how all of us are locked together. And in the summer months, you can actually see when we have multiple planets up, like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, you can see them start to make that line in the sky. And that's showing you that ecliptic that the planets are on. And you can see that it's different than where the zodiac constellations are. And then, so that's kind of the science behind how we got constellations. And then moving into just the history of people looking at constellations, it's nothing new. It wasn't just Western science that came up with constellations. This is actually a cave painting in France. These are the Lascaux cave paintings, and they are 17,000 years old. And this is depicting the constellation of Taurus, the bull. And obviously we can kind of make out that bull there, but where is the constellation? And so I'll give y'all a moment to speak with your friends, maybe the people sitting around you. Don't be shy. And see if you can figure out where that constellation might be here in this image. All right, I'll see how confident you guys are. Was anybody right? No? All right. Well, This is definitely not a cow to me. It looks like a sideways stick figure taking a nap without a head, right? So constellations take a little bit of imagination. But back to the cave painting, like, was that really there? Well, if you look up in his face here, you can see that same V from our stick figure. So that's showing us that this probably is of the constellation. But the thing that's really confirming it for us is actually this grouping of stars right here. And if you notice, we have that grouping of stars just above. And now that is the Pleiades, which is an open star cluster. It's sometimes known as the Seven Sisters. And so this is a very small star cluster. We also have globular star clusters, which means there's about 100,000 stars within that cluster. There'll be one coming up in summer that I'm really excited to talk about. But like I said, this one's smaller. It's the Seven Sisters. And it brings me to the James Webb Telescope, which was launched back on Christmas. And actually today, it completed its mirror alignment, which means it's just about ready to start taking pictures. So hopefully by the next presentation, we'll have some awesome photographs that it's been taking. And so its mission is to look at infrared versions of things in space to see if there's anything that we're missing. So we're trying to look at the heat signatures of things. And so that's easier to detect something like a star that maybe we can't see. Because if it's really far away, maybe the light hasn't reached us yet. But we can tell it's hot over there. So it should be really interesting to find out what James Webb is coming back with in the next few months. But moving into more of the constellations, so we have Taurus up here, and we can see the Pleiades just right up there. And so next we'll talk about Gemini, which is the twins. And you can start to see this is forming that zodiac ecliptic, right? We have Cancer and then Leo. So that's how it rises. It does actually rise on that angle. And so now talking about the story of the Gemini twins, they were the sons of Zeus, and they were a little crazy about the ladies. And they were so crazy that they fought people over the ladies that they wanted to date. And in one of their escapades, one of the twins did not live. And the other twin was very sad about the death of his brother. And so he asked Zeus, can you help us come back together by making us immortal and placing us in the stars? And Zeus, having those powers, placed them together forever. And they are connected up there. And then moving right along past Gemini, we'll talk about Leo the lion. And Leo is actually the 12th largest constellation in the entire night sky. That's northern and southern hemisphere. So it's a very large constellation. And the story with Leo is he is associated with Hercules. And Leo was one of the 12 labors that Hercules had to go through. And the first time that Hercules came up to the lion, he actually lost. And that's because Leo the lion had impenetrable skin. You couldn't pierce it. And Hercules brought arrows, which that didn't work in his battle against this lion. And so the next time Hercules encountered the lion, he was a little smarter. He trapped the lion in its cave, and he just kind of waited him out, and eventually he grappled with the beast, who was very weak, and Hercules won. And to protect himself and to also make himself look more fearsome, he decided, I want this lion's pelt to protect me. But again, you can't cut that pelt. So he actually used the lion's own claws to take that pelt, and then he wore it for some of the rest of those 12 labors that he had to complete. And to remember those labors, Zeus placed Leo into the sky so Hercules could remember all of the struggles that he overcame. And so this, like I said, is a large constellation, and it has some very bright stars in it. And so the brightest star is right here. Its name is Regulus. And this is kind of like the foot of the lion. And then we'll come up to this star and imagine it's the front shoulder of the lion. And then if you kind of see this curve here, that would be like the mane or the head of our lion. And then we'll come across to over here. This is going across the back of our lion. So now I'm in the back hip. We'll come down to this star. This is the back foot. And then back to the hip. And then coming down to the tail. And now I'm back at the hip. And so here's kind of a drawing of it. It's not necessarily the most easily recognizable as a lion. And I don't know about y'all, but I definitely see it more as a mouse, right? So my point in constellations is, okay, maybe people see it as Leo the lion. I love Leo the constellation because I see it as a mouse, and it's really easy when you picture it as a mouse. So whatever constellations that you see and you just can recognize, that's all that's important. Constellations are just the scientific version of it. So that's kind of what I always like to make, is constellations can be whatever you make them. And then we're going to move into probably one of the most recognizable constellations, which is the Big Dipper. And this is a Vincent van Gogh painting depicting the Big Dipper. But I actually have some bad news for you. The Big Dipper is not actually a constellation. It's actually what we call an asterism, which means it's just a smaller grouping of stars that makes up a larger constellation. And so the larger constellation is Ursa Major, which is the Big Bear. And then our Little Dipper would be Ursa Minor, or the Baby Bear. And so here's the whole constellation drawn out. You can see the dipper there in the hip and the tail region of our bear, but it extends all the way down to having feet and a head. So it's a little bit larger than just that dipper that we all recognize. And so here it is kind of in the night sky. You can see it's right by Gemini, which is over here. And then here is Ursa Major. And so I always like to find a constellation that you're really good at and then use that to cheat and find all of the other constellations. So the Big Dipper is one that's pretty easy to recognize. And so we use that one a lot in astronomy to find other constellations. So for example, we'll take this end of the cup of our Big Dipper and we'll just draw a line down here, and that's the brightest star in Leo, Regulus. And kind of once you find Regulus, it's easy to find the rest of it. And then if you go the reverse direction there, so on that edge of the dipper, and you were to draw it up, that's Polaris, our North Star, and is the end of the handle of our Little Dipper. And then the other thing that makes the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper kind of easy to find is maybe one's not all the way out, but in this position, imagine there was water in the Little Dipper. It would be pouring into the cup of the Big Dipper. And then as the seasons change and the Big Dipper becomes the one that's on top, the water would pour out of the Big Dipper back into that Little Dipper. So if you can find one, you can kind of imagine water going somewhere. And then we are going to move down now. We're going to use the handle of our Big Dipper. We're going to use that to find this star right here. Its name is Arcturus. Well, we'll do that next. You can imagine where all the lines are. So Arcturus is the brightest star in the constellation of Boötes, and Boötes is an ox driver, and he has his oxen that are roaming around the night sky with him, and because they are so close to Polaris, it's said that he's just constantly driving them around that northern pole, and he doesn't really ever get a break. And so again, this is supposed to be a person. I see it as a kite with legs. So again, some creativity there. And so going back to that dipper, this time it's on its side. I'm tricking you all a little bit here, making you recognize it, those 3 stars in the handle. You're going to use that arc in our handle, and we're going to arc to Arcturus. Okay? So that's how we find that star. And now the kite is on its side again. So we're just going to come up to this star. Here we're making our kite. And then coming back down. And the legs are always pretty dim, so you can just pick any of the other stars as its legs. And so that's how you would find Boötes and Arcturus, but that little namesake of arc to Arcturus doesn't end there. We then spike to the star Spica to find the constellation of Virgo. And Virgo is actually the 2nd largest constellation in the entire night sky. So that's incredible. It just takes up so much space. And within this constellation, it has 20 known stars that have planets orbiting it. And within that, it is also home to the Virgo cluster, which contains about 1,300, maybe even 2,000 galaxies. Like, think about that for a moment, right? Like, there's probably somebody in one of those galaxies listening to the same presentation. Maybe. I always like to think, what else is out there? But because it's so far away, we'll just never know if they're out there. And again, some artistic liberties taken in the drawing of Virgo. In this version, it's more of kind of the body shape. It's got that keystone shape, and then 2 arms, 2 legs. You can pick which one's which for your own liking. And so you can start to see that zodiac again. We have our Gemini twins. Cancer is this guy right here. We've got Leo, and we have Virgo. And if any of you are wondering, like, it's May, but Virgo is like September birthdays, so like, why is that in the sky now? It's not when it's in the sky, it's when the sun passes through that constellation. And so the sun will pass through Virgo in September, but we see the constellation here. So it'll be elsewhere in the world that they'll see both. And then the other thing that I want to point out, and I'm sure you noticed when the dipper kind of changed to be on its side, we display these sideways because as they're rising, they come up sideways, and then as they set, they look right side up. So we kind of describe them sideways to begin with so you can kind of picture it for the early part of the season. And now again, you can use your friends around you, see if you've learned anything about our Western constellations, see if you recognize any of them. Is anyone feeling a little more confident than before? No? Uh-oh. All right, well, we'll move now into our Lakota constellations. And what I really want to emphasize with the Lakota constellations is that they are very big on the concept of mirroring, which means what is in the sky is also on Earth. And they use that to help them tell when they need to have their ceremonies. And so we have some videos from Craig Howe, and he is going to describe some of these constellations in addition to some of the stories that I have for you. So we're going to start with a video about mirroring.
This idea that we are related to all the parts of the universe is very important in the Lakota way of thinking. But at the time of our ancestors, life was a lot more difficult. And the margin for error was small. So one way Lakotas mitigated this unpredictability of the environment was to establish relationships with all of these living entities. So they would make essentially like treaties with the cottonwood trees or with the geese or with the grasses in the rocks. They would have all these relationships that were established with all these other oyates or peoples. All of those entities were seen as living and as relatives to the Lakotas. And that's the way the Lakota world was structured, with all these things we see on this world, and also with the stars and all of the things in the sky as well.
This is a hide map of the Black Hills, and it shows really well the constellation I'll talk about first, which is the racetrack. And the racetrack goes around the entire Black Hills, and the story that goes along with it is that it was a race between the 2-leggeds and the 4-leggeds to determine who had dominion over who could eat who. And so it was every animal, the humans, the birds, they all had to participate in this race. And it was 4 laps around all of the Black Hills. And as you can imagine, 4 laps around the entire Black Hills is a very long race. And you're eventually going to be wearing that skin off of the bottom of your feet, right? Just because you're running on rocks. And so throughout the course of this race, these 2-leggeds and 4-leggeds, they were bleeding on the rocks, leaving this blood trail behind them. And this race just continued on and continued on. And the magpie, it noticed the buffalo was kind of getting out far ahead. And so the magpie flew on ahead, and it flew onto the back of the buffalo. And it just rode all the way out to the end of the race just before the finish line, and then it just soared out in front of the buffalo and won. And so that is why the two-leggeds get to eat the four-leggeds, because the magpie rode on the buffalo. And the Lakota still very much revere the magpie for this. And what's interesting is in science we call that loop around the Black Hills region the Spearfish Formation, and it's a very red color. So do you remember how we got that red stained rock? It's very interesting, right? So that's the racetrack. And in the constellations, they also have this circle. And you might recognize some of these stars. These are Gemini right here. And we have our Pleiades up here. And then this little V shape is Taurus again. And so they have those same constellations, or those same stars, but they see it as a big circle representing all of the Black Hills. And this is another drawing in showing how the locations correlate to it. And so we have the whole circle of all those stars representing all of the Black Hills. And then in the center of it, that correlates to the center of the Black Hills, which is Pei-Shla. And Pei-Shla is actually where they will be going in mid-May, so in maybe a week or two. And that's where they have their spring ceremonies to prepare for the sun dance. And so what they'll do is they'll pour water in the ground to encourage plants to grow back. They'll sprinkle seed to encourage the birds. And they'll leave offerings to help the four-leggeds, because they are very thankful that they get to eat those four-leggeds. And then, I guess I can show you here too, it's definitely a different geologic formation than the rest of the Black Hills. And so it's very recognizable, just like in the constellations. And then the next one we'll look at is this kind of rectangle shape up here. And that correlates to Devil's Tower, or Matotipila. And so the story for Matotipila that the Lakota have is that they have a couple of different versions. It's either a set of twins or a set of 7 girls. And it's that these 7 girls, they were being chased by bears. And they didn't know how to get away. And so they were just running and running, and they were crying out, hoping someone could help them. And then Falling Star heard them, and he started to cause the ground that they were standing on to rise. And the bears, they didn't realize it at first what was happening, until it was too late and the ground was too high, and so they were clawing at the sides of this rising rock. And they weren't successful in climbing, and you can see their scratch marks down the sides of Matotipila. And all those rocks at the bottom is what buried those bears. And then Falling Star rescued the 7 girls from the top, but to help people remember the story, he placed them in the stars as well, which, do we have any guesses as to what that might be? What else had 7? Back from the Western constellations. 7 sisters, the Pleiades, right? So that is their story for the Pleiades. And now we're going to listen to how Matotipila is both a constellation and a landmark.
There are 2 fascinating stories related to Matotipila. The first deals with the sun dance, and Black Elk tells us that a man named Kabaya received the vision of the sun dance at Matotipila, and that is one of the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Lakota people. The first time in the High Dog winter count that the sun dance appears is for the year 1820-1821. The name for that year is Wi Ihamble Iewachigi, meaning he danced in accord with his vision of the sun. The second fascinating story about Matotipila is that there's a constellation in the sky that has that very same name. The Lakota constellation called Matotipila corresponds to the Greek constellation called Gemini. And if you look at the shape of Gemini, it's an elongated rectangle. And when Gemini rises in the east, it's horizontal, paralleled with the horizon. And then as it rotates through the sky, it stands up. And then when it sets in the western horizon, the orientation is vertical. And it parallels the relationship and the angle of Matotipila, the landmark. So among Lakotas, Matotipila has another name, Patehechi, gray buffalo horn. When that constellation is in position to mirror the landmark, the two shapes suggest the horns of a buffalo bull. This is exactly what we see in the ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock of Matotipila.
And so just reviewing some of those constellations again, we have that whole hoop, which is all of the Black Hills, and then Matotipila, which is just that Devil's Tower portion of the Black Hills. And moving just a little bit farther, when these constellations are starting to set in the east and these ones are in the west, we start to have the Dipper. And then we have this little arc right here. And so we'll start learning about our Dipper here.
From a Lakota viewpoint, when an individual is born, they are given a spirit, a wanahi, from a star. And then they live their whole life with that wanahi, with that spirit. And then when they die on this earth, that spirit leaves and it goes into the cup of the Big Dipper. The 4 stars then carry that spirit to the Milky Way, and those 4 stars are called the carriers. Sometimes they're seen as individuals carrying a blanket with a spirit between them, and sometimes, Biko mentions this, they are horses that are carrying the spirit to the Milky Way. Now, the Big Dipper has 7 stars. The other 3 stars in the handle are the mourners. So 4 carriers and 3 mourners accompany the spirit to the Milky Way. In Lakota, the Milky Way is called the Wanahi Tachanku, the spirit trail.
So we have that Dipper, and then just like we did before, we can use the edge of that cup to come down, and this is Regulus again from Leo, our lion. And some Lakota include that within this little hoop constellation, and some do not. This drawing in particular does not. Both is just kind of are right. And this constellation represents a fireplace because that is their purification lodge. And it's a Lakota ritual, and they'll bring rocks that have been heating up in a fireplace for long periods of time, and then they'll pour water onto those rocks to create steam. And the steam is that physical vessel for them to receive the holy breath. And this is a ceremony for them for spiritual regeneration and of dying and of rebirth. And so that's what this represents, is that ark where they would put the rocks in that fireplace. And we'll just review all of those constellations one more time. Looking for that circular pattern of the hoop, you can look for the Dipper and look for the fireplace as well. I'll give you a few moments just to try to practice finding those. Maybe a little easier once you've seen the Western ones. And I'll just turn the lines back on, help you out one last time. And I just want to leave y'all with one final thought from Craig about the importance of studying Lakota star stories and the importance of sharing them.
What we know about Lakota star knowledge is based on centuries of observations by Lakotas. Lakota homelands are perfect places to observe the stars. The Lakota peoples of the past were astute observers and critical thinkers. This exploration of traditional narratives and historical events is based on a deep reverence for Lakota star knowledge. By studying this star knowledge, we can get a glimpse into the integrated and sophisticated structure of Lakota philosophy. And it's this unique philosophy that connects the world when we and Hanwi travel together with the world of the students at Spring Creek. When Ella Deloria wrote her book, Speaking of Indians, in the 1940s, she drew on a number of sources in Lakota communities to help her to understand the past, what she called the ancient ways. So she says that these men were Christian men, mature leaders in the community at that time. And she said they had no wish for the outgrowth of the ancient way. But she then says they would tell her about that ancient way for hours on end. And she described that as they would do so with tender reverence. This idea that they were telling about the beliefs of their forefathers, and that they didn't believe it, but they gave it the respect it deserved because their forefathers believed it. These star stories would fit entirely within that realm of literature that we should show tender reverence to. Whether we believe it or not is not important. This is what Lakota ancestors believed. This is what they were telling their children. And if we want to understand Lakotas at that time, and then the connection between that time and today, then we need to study these, not as fairy tales, but as great literature.
And then just to summarize both sets of constellations, this is a map that includes both the Western and the Lakota constellations. So the Lakota are colorized, and then you can see kind of this peach color. For example, I'm drawing the bear here, and those are the Western constellations. And you're welcome to walk up here if you need a closer view of any of them. And this is a seasonal program, like I said before, and you can kind of preview what's coming up in the summer here. And if any of y'all have any questions about anything, feel free to come ask. So thank y'all very much for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.